May 13th, 1946, 2 a.m. The guillotine blade is already in position. Elisabeth Becker, the woman the prisoners called the Beast of Ravensbrück, who perfected torture into a science, who turned cruelty into a daily ritual, who made concentration camp guards look compassionate by comparison, stands in Hamelin Prison's execution chamber. Her hands are bound behind her back. No blindfold. French execution protocol demands she see the blade that will kill her. But here's what makes this execution different from every other Nazi war criminal death you've heard about. Elisabeth Becker doesn't break. Not when they read the sentence, not when they walk her to the guillotine, not even when they strap her to the plank. She maintains the same cold, contemptuous expression she wore while torturing prisoners, right up until the moment the blade falls. Trust me, what you're about to hear isn't just about one woman's death. It's about how a sadist who turned a concentration camp into her personal torture laboratory finally faced the violence she inflicted on thousands. And unlike the quick deaths she sometimes granted her victims, her execution, due to a malfunction most witnesses believe was deliberate, takes longer than anyone expected. Let me take you into that execution chamber. It's a converted warehouse in Hamelin Prison, British-occupied Germany. The room is sparse, concrete floor, stone walls, a single barred window where dawn light is just beginning to creep through. The guillotine stands in the center, freshly sharpened, tested multiple times that evening. 42 official witnesses crowd the space, British military officers, French prosecutors, representatives from 7 allied nations, Polish survivors who testified at her trial. Everyone wants to see the beast fall. The sound in that room before the execution, absolute silence. Not even breathing is audible, just the occasional drip of water somewhere in the building, the distant sound of guards changing shifts outside. Becker stands rigid despite her bound hands. Even now, even seconds from death, her posture is perfect, back straight, chin up, the bearing of someone who spent years believing herself superior to everyone around her. When they remove her to the execution chamber from her cell, other condemned prisoners will later report hearing her laugh, not hysterical laughter, cold, contemptuous laughter, like this is all beneath her. Pforzheim, Germany, 1923. She's born Elisabeth Hessel into a middle-class family. Her father is a factory foreman. Her mother runs a boarding house. It's a normal, unremarkable childhood in Weimar, Germany, until it isn't. Here's what people don't understand about Elisabeth Becker. She wasn't born into poverty or abuse. She wasn't traumatized or victimized. She came from a stable, functioning family. She had opportunities, education, a future. But even as a child, there are red flags everyone misses. Her teachers describe young Elisabeth as unnaturally cold. She doesn't play with other children. She doesn't cry when hurt. When she's 9 years old, she's caught systematically destroying another girl's possessions, not in anger, but methodically, one item at a time, watching the girl's distress with clinical interest. When confronted, Elisabeth shows no remorse. Her explanation, "I wanted to see what she would do." Not an accident, not a fight, an experiment in causing pain. Her parents dismiss it as childhood cruelty. Children can be mean, they tell themselves. She'll grow out of it. She doesn't. At 16, she's expelled from secondary school for what the records vaguely describe as disciplinary issues involving systematic intimidation of younger students. The details are sealed, but classmates later recall Elisabeth running what amounted to a protection racket. Younger girls paid her in food, money, or personal services to avoid being targeted for harassment. Again, not random bullying. Organized, systematic, a hierarchy of fear that she controlled from the top. By 1939, when war breaks out, Elisabeth is working as a nurse in a Pforzheim hospital. On paper, this seems like a caring profession. In reality, hospital staff file multiple complaints about her behavior with patients. She's rough with those in pain, not accidentally, but deliberately, applying pressure to wounds when changing bandages, forgetting to provide pain medication to patients she dislikes. One supervisor writes in a disciplinary report, "Nurse Hessel appears to derive satisfaction from patient discomfort. Recommend reassignment." She's not reassigned. She's recruited. In 1942, the SS is expanding its concentration camp system. They need guards, particularly female guards for women's camps. They're looking for a specific type of person, someone who can maintain order through fear, who won't be squeamish about violence, who can follow orders no matter how brutal. Elisabeth Hessel volunteers. Not because she believes in Nazi ideology. Interviews and testimony suggest she barely understood or cared about the political philosophy. She volunteers because the concentration camp system offers her something she can't get anywhere else: unlimited power over vulnerable people and official sanction to exercise that power however she wants. She's 21 years old when she arrives at Ravensbrück concentration camp in northern Germany. Within 6 months, she's promoted to senior guard. Within a year, the prisoners have given her a nickname that will follow her to the gallows: the Beast. And she earns it.
The innovation. Torture as performance art. What separates Elisabeth Becker from other concentration camp guards is her creativity. She doesn't just follow orders to punish prisoners. She turns punishment into elaborate rituals designed to maximize psychological and physical suffering. Her signature method becomes known among prisoners as the selection. But it's not a selection for gas chambers or work details. It's worse. Here's how it works. Becker enters a barracks unannounced, often in the middle of the night. She walks slowly down the rows of bunks, tapping her riding crop, her constant companion, which she's named My Pet, against her palm. The sound echoes in the silent barracks. Tap, tap, tap. She stops at random bunks, points her crop at a prisoner. You. The selected woman must stand. Becker inspects her, looking for any violation of camp rules, any imperfection, any excuse. A button slightly crooked, hair not perfectly arranged, eye contact that's too direct or not direct enough. There's always something wrong, because Becker decides what's wrong. The punishment varies, but it's always disproportionate and always designed for maximum psychological impact. One survivor testifies that Becker forced a woman to stand outside in winter for 11 hours because her headscarf was improperly tied. The woman lost 3 toes to frostbite. When she was finally allowed inside, Becker made her thank her for the lesson in obedience. But the true horror of Becker's selections isn't the punishment itself, it's the waiting. Every woman in that barracks knows she might be next. Every night, every random moment. There's no pattern, no logic, no way to avoid it. Becker creates a state of perpetual terror where the anticipation of punishment is almost worse than the punishment itself. The water treatment. Becker's most infamous innovation is what prisoners call the water treatment. It's not waterboarding, that comes later in history. This is something she develops herself. The procedure is meticulously documented in prisoner testimony. A prisoner is stripped naked and forced to kneel on the concrete floor of the punishment barracks. Buckets of ice-cold water are poured over her head continuously, not enough to drown, just enough to make breathing difficult, to cause hypothermia, to create panic. But here's the diabolical detail. Becker times it. She uses a stopwatch. She's experimenting to find the exact duration that causes maximum suffering without causing death, because dead prisoners can't be punished again.
Survivors testify that Becker takes notes during these sessions. She records how long it takes for different body types to begin showing signs of hypothermia. She notes which prisoners beg for mercy and which stay silent. She's treating human suffering like a laboratory experiment. One Polish resistance fighter, testifying at Becker's trial, describes being subjected to the water treatment for 45 minutes. She stood there with her stopwatch and her notebook. Every few minutes, she'd stop the water and ask me questions, not about resistance activities, just personal questions. Are you cold? Do you want it to stop? What would you do for me to make it stop? She wasn't interrogating me for information, she was studying my responses. The witness pauses, fighting tears. When I finally collapsed, she seemed disappointed. She wrote something in her notebook and said, "Only 45 minutes, others have lasted longer." Like it was a competition, like my suffering was a score to beat. The children of Ravensbrück. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Becker's cruelty is her treatment of children. Ravensbrück holds approximately 800 children at various times, some born in the camp, others imprisoned with their mothers. Becker develops what she calls discipline training for children as young as 4 years old. If a child cries, she forces them to stand at attention for hours. If they fail to stand properly, she beats their mothers in front of them. One survivor describes watching Becker force a 6-year-old girl to hold a brick above her head for an hour. When the child's arms gave out and the brick fell, Becker didn't punish the child, she punished the mother. 20 lashes with Becker's riding crop while the child watched. She wanted the child to feel responsible. She wanted to teach the child that her weakness caused her mother's suffering. She was creating trauma deliberately, systematically. Another witness describes Becker's game. She would place a piece of bread just out of reach of starving children, then beat any child who tried to grab it, not because taking the bread violated rules, but because she enjoyed watching them struggle between hunger and fear. She's not just cruel, she's pedagogically cruel, teaching lessons in helplessness, in worthlessness, in the futility of hope. The medical experiments. In 1943, Ravensbrück becomes a site for medical experiments. Nazi doctors test various procedures on prisoners, studying infection, testing drugs, performing unnecessary surgeries to train military doctors. Becker isn't a doctor, but she volunteers to assist in the experiments. Her role is officially described as patient restraint and transport. In reality, she's selecting which prisoners will be subjected to experimentation and ensuring they remain compliant during procedures. Survivors of the medical block describe Becker's method. She doesn't just physically restrain struggling prisoners, she psychologically breaks them first. She describes in vivid detail what the doctors will do to them. She shows them previous victims' scars. She makes them watch other prisoners being experimented on before their own turn. One witness testifies about being subjected to bone grafting experiments. Doctors would remove sections of bone from her leg to study healing processes. Becker came to my barracks the night before. She described the entire procedure, how they would cut into my leg, how they wouldn't use enough anesthesia because they needed to limit costs, how I would probably never walk properly again. She didn't have to do this. She did it because she enjoyed seeing my terror. The witness continues, "The next morning when they came to take me to surgery, I was so paralyzed with fear that I couldn't resist. That's what she wanted. She wanted us too terrified to fight back." 74 women are subjected to these bone experiments. 5 die from infections. Most are permanently disabled. Becker's role in their suffering isn't medical, it's psychological. She's the architect of their despair. The Liberation, April 1945. When Soviet forces liberate Ravensbrück on April 30, 1945, They find approximately 3,000 prisoners still alive, most barely surviving, many too weak to walk. The camp has been systematically evacuated in the weeks prior, with thousands of prisoners forced on death marches westward. Elisabeth Becker isn't there. She fled 3 days earlier with a group of SS personnel, attempting to disappear into the chaos of collapsing Nazi Germany. But she makes a crucial mistake. She takes her notebooks. While other concentration camp personnel destroy evidence, Becker keeps her meticulous records, years of notes documenting her experiments in torture, her observations on prisoners' responses to different punishments, her refinements to her methods. Why does she keep them? Psychological experts who later evaluate her suggest she's genuinely proud of her work. In her mind, these notebooks represent scientific advancement, professional development. She sees herself as a pioneer in what she calls compliance psychology. She's not ashamed, she's accomplished. British forces capture her on May 8, 1945, VE Day, the official end of the war in Europe. She's hiding in a farmhouse near Hamburg, using false papers identifying her as Anna Weber, displaced person. The papers might have worked. She might have disappeared into the millions of displaced persons flooding post-war Europe. But a Polish woman who survived Ravensbrück recognizes her in a refugee processing center. Not her face. Becker has dyed her hair and lost significant weight. The woman recognizes her hands. "I watched those hands beat my sister to death," the survivor later testified. "I would know them anywhere." British military police arrest Becker. When they search her belongings, they find the notebooks, hundreds of pages documenting atrocities in her own handwriting. She's convicted by her own records. The trial, Ravensbrück before the court. The Ravensbrück trial begins in December 1946 in Hamburg, conducted by British military authorities. 16 female guards and 5 male SS officers are prosecuted. Elisabeth Becker is defendant number 3. The evidence against her is overwhelming. Testimony from 150 survivors, her personal notebooks documenting torture methods, photographs of victims showing injuries consistent with her described techniques, corroboration from other guards who describe her methods. But what truly damns her is her demeanor during the trial. Other defendants show some emotion, crying, expressing remorse, genuine or performed, at least attempting to appear human. Some claim they were following orders. Others claim they tried to help prisoners secretly. Becker shows nothing. She sits ramrod straight, her face expressionless, her eyes cold. When survivors testify, she doesn't look away. She stares at them directly, sometimes with what witnesses describe as a slight smile. When a woman describes being beaten unconscious by Becker, Becker leans to her defense attorney and whispers something. The attorney later reveals she was correcting details of the testimony. She didn't beat that prisoner unconscious with 20 strikes, it was 18. She wanted the record to be accurate. Even on trial for her life, even listening to testimony about the suffering she caused, she's focused on procedural accuracy. The prosecution calls her notebooks as evidence. The prosecutor reads excerpts aloud. Subject 347, Polish political, age 24, subjected to water treatment for 52 minutes. Response: begging ceased after 31 minutes, replaced with silent sobbing. Conclusion: extended duration past 30 minutes produces more complete psychological submission than shorter, more intense sessions. The courtroom is silent. The prosecutor continues. Subject 412, Jewish, age 19, disciplined for eye contact infraction. Method: standing punishment, 14 hours, winter conditions. Result: frostbite injuries to extremities. Subject maintained defiant attitude throughout. Conclusion: physical punishment alone insufficient for this personality type. Recommend psychological component for future discipline. One notebook entry is particularly damning. Children respond more effectively to indirect punishment, punishment of mother or sibling, than direct punishment. Hypothesis: attachment bonds create stronger compliance motivation than personal fear. Further testing required. She's describing torturing mothers in front of children as testing a hypothesis. When the prosecutor asks if these are her notebooks, Becker confirms, yes. Did you write these entries? Yes. Do you stand by these observations? Her answer stuns the courtroom. They are empirically accurate based on my observations. Whether the methods were appropriate is not for me to judge. I was following camp protocols. She's not denying anything. She's not claiming the notebooks are fabricated or taken out of context. She's confirming their accuracy and defending them as legitimate professional documentation. The chief prosecutor asks her directly, "Frau Becker, do you feel any remorse for what you did to these women and children?" Her response, recorded verbatim in trial transcripts: "I performed my duties as assigned. Remorse implies I had discretion in my actions. I was following orders and maintaining camp discipline. My personal feelings are irrelevant." A survivor in the gallery shouts, "You enjoyed it. We saw you smile." Becker turns to look at the woman. Her face shows no emotion. She simply says, "Whether I enjoyed my work is also irrelevant. I was effective. That's what mattered." The prosecutor tries again, "But surely you can acknowledge that your actions caused immense suffering. Suffering was the intended outcome of disciplinary measures. If my actions didn't cause suffering, they would have been ineffective." She's admitting to torture while simultaneously claiming it was justified because it worked. The verdict. The tribunal deliberates for 3 days. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant shows no remorse. The crimes are horrific. On March 3, 1947, the verdict is read. Guilty of crimes against humanity. Guilty of war crimes. Guilty of murder. Sentence: death by guillotine. When the sentence is read, Becker stands. No visible reaction. No tears, no shock. She simply nods once, like she's acknowledging receipt of information, and sits down. In her cell afterwards, guards report she seems almost relieved. The uncertainty is over. She knows her fate.
May 12, 1947. The final hours. Elisabeth Becker spends her last day in cell 12 at Hamelin prison. Unlike other condemned prisoners who write emotional letters to family, who meet with clergy, who express final regrets, Becker spends the day organizing her possessions. She folds her clothes precisely. She arranges her few personal items in neat rows. She writes a brief letter to her sister, not emotional, just logistical instructions about what to do with her belongings. A Catholic priest visits, offering spiritual counsel. Becker declines. She's not religious, she explains. She sees no point in deathbed conversions. The priest tries anyway. Do you want to confess your sins? To seek forgiveness? Becker's response, according to the priest's later report, I don't believe I sinned. I followed orders. I did my job. Whether others judge that as wrong is their concern, not mine. The priest is stunned. You caused immense suffering. Surely you can acknowledge that. I acknowledge that my actions caused suffering. I don't acknowledge that causing suffering in service of orders constitutes sin. Even hours before execution, she cannot or will not engage with the moral weight of what she's done. At 1 a.m., guards inform her it's time. Execution is scheduled for 2 a.m., early morning, when the prison is quietest, when witnesses can arrive under cover of darkness. Becker stands, smooths her prison dress, runs her fingers through her hair one final time. She walks to the execution chamber without assistance. No stumbling, no resistance. Perfect military bearing.
The corridor to the execution chamber is long, deliberately so, giving condemned prisoners time to contemplate their fate. Other prisoners report hearing condemned people crying, praying, begging during this walk. Guards report that Becker walks in complete silence. Her footsteps are steady, her breathing controlled. She looks straight ahead. One guard later says, "It was unnerving. She walked to her execution like she was walking to a meeting. No fear, no emotion, nothing." The execution chamber. The guillotine at Hamelin prison is a French model, imported specifically for executing war criminals. It's more modern than the guillotines of the French Revolution, but the principle is the same. A weighted blade falls from approximately 14 feet, severing the head in a fraction of a second. In theory, it's one of the most humane execution methods ever devised. The blade falls at approximately 21 feet per second. Severing the spinal cord should cause instant unconsciousness. Medical experts estimate death occurs in 2 to 3 seconds. Should. When Becker enters the chamber, she sees the guillotine for the first time. Witnesses report she pauses, just for a moment, and studies it. Not with fear, with clinical interest, like she's analyzing a piece of equipment. 42 witnesses stand in careful rows. Several are survivors of Ravensbrück, invited by prosecutors to see justice done. When Becker's eyes sweep across the crowd, she makes eye contact with several of them. One survivor later describes the moment. "She looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw no recognition, no remorse, nothing. It was like I wasn't even human to her, even now, even at her execution." The executioner, a French specialist brought in for this purpose, explains the procedure. She will be strapped to a plank. The plank will be tilted forward, positioning her neck in the lunette, the curved wooden restraint that holds the head in place. The blade will fall. Becker listens without expression. When asked if she understands, she says simply, "Yes." No last statement is offered. French execution protocol doesn't include final words. The condemned is simply processed. Guards escort Becker to the plank. She doesn't resist as they strap her down. Leather restraints secure her torso, arms, and legs. The plank is tilted forward with mechanical precision. Her neck is positioned in the lunette. The curved wooden restraint closes around her throat, holding her head immobile. From this position, she can see the basket below, where her head will fall. She stares into it without visible emotion. The executioner checks all restraints, confirms the blade is properly positioned, gives a final look to the commanding officer. The officer nods. The executioner's hand moves to the release mechanism. And then something happens that witnesses will argue about for decades. Elisabeth Becker speaks. She's not supposed to. There's no protocol for final words. But in the silence before the blade falls, clear enough for everyone to hear, she says 5 words. "I was good at it." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "God forgive me." Not even defiance. Just cold, factual self-assessment. To the very end, she's evaluating her performance. The executioner, perhaps shocked by this statement, perhaps intentionally, perhaps just following protocol, hesitates for 2 seconds. Then he pulls the release. 2:02 a.m., May 13, 1947. The blade drops. In a properly functioning guillotine execution, what happens next should be instantaneous. The 88-pound blade, falling from 14 feet, strikes the neck with enough force to sever the spinal cord, cut through vertebrae, and separate the head from the body in approximately 0.005 seconds. The condemned feels nothing. Consciousness ends before pain signals can reach the brain. It's mechanically perfect, surgically precise. That's not what happens to Elisabeth Becker. Multiple witnesses report that the blade doesn't fall cleanly. Something, witnesses disagree on whether it's a mechanical issue or deliberate sabotage, causes the blade to drag slightly on the right side of the guide rails. The blade still falls, still carries massive force, but instead of the instantaneous severing of a clean drop, the blade comes down at a slight angle. It hits Becker's neck off-center. Medical experts who later review the execution report and witness testimony estimate what happens in the next few seconds. The blade strikes with enough force to fracture the cervical vertebrae and partially sever the spinal cord, but the angle means it doesn't complete the cut on the first impact. The blade embeds approximately 3/4 of the way through the neck. For a fraction of a second, witnesses estimate 0.5 to 1.2 seconds, Elisabeth Becker is alive, conscious, and aware that she's being decapitated. The blade, now lodged in her neck, is pulled back up by the executioner to attempt a second drop. This is not standard procedure. In a proper execution, one drop is sufficient. The need for a second drop indicates a malfunction, or something worse. The blade is raised, blood is visible on it now, dripping back down onto Becker's partially severed neck. The witnesses are frozen in horror. This isn't how it's supposed to happen. Even for a war criminal, even for the beast of Ravensbrück, this is barbaric. The executioner drops the blade again. This time, it completes the cut. Becker's head separates from her body and falls into the basket below. Her body, still strapped to the plank, convulses, the involuntary muscle spasms of a corpse, neurological signals firing without purpose. Total time from first blade drop to complete decapitation, approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds doesn't sound like much, but count it out. 4 seconds of being partially decapitated, of feeling the blade lodge in your neck, of knowing with absolute certainty that you're dying in the most violent way possible. For a woman who spent years studying how to maximize suffering, who took notes on the exact duration of torture that caused maximum psychological damage, 4 seconds of experiencing her own violent death carries a terrible symmetry. The controversy. In the hours and days after the execution, questions emerge. Was the malfunction accidental? The guillotine was tested multiple times before the execution. It functioned perfectly in tests. Why did it fail with Becker? Several witnesses quietly report that the executioner, a French specialist whose family died at Ravensbrück, seemed to position the blade guide incorrectly. Not obviously wrong, just slightly off, enough to cause the angle that led to the malfunction. Was it deliberate? Was this French executioner's way of ensuring that Becker suffered, even for a few seconds, the way his family suffered? No formal investigation is ever conducted. The official report states only, sentence carried out, subject deceased at 02:02 a.m., May 13, 1947. The executioner never speaks publicly about the execution. He dies in 1953, taking whatever truth he knows to his grave. The body. Following execution, Becker's body is removed from the guillotine, her head placed in the basket, her body on a stretcher. They're photographed separately for official records, proof for the historical record. The photographs show the brutality of the botched execution. The first blade strike left massive trauma on the right side of her neck. The second strike completed the decapitation, but left jagged edges, not the clean cut of a properly functioning guillotine. She died hard. Whether by accident or design, Elisabeth Becker's death was not the clinical, painless procedure it should have been. Her body and head are placed in a plain wooden coffin. No ceremony, no mourners, just military efficiency. Unlike the Japanese war criminals whose ashes were scattered to prevent shrines, Becker is buried in an unmarked grave in the Hamelin prison cemetery. The location is recorded, but never publicized.
Years later, when the prison is decommissioned, the cemetery is relocated. Her remains, along with other executed war criminals, are moved to an undisclosed location. Today, no one knows where Elisabeth Becker's body actually rests. Complete anonymity in death for a woman who spent her life making herself unforgettable through cruelty. The notebooks. Becker's meticulous torture notebooks survive the execution. They're kept as evidence, stored in British military archives, classified for decades. In the 1970s, portions are declassified for historical research. Psychologists studying the perpetrators of Nazi atrocities request access. What they find disturbs them profoundly. One researcher writes, "These aren't the ravings of a sadistic monster, they're clinical observations written in the detached language of scientific research." She describes torture victims as subjects. She refers to their screams as vocal responses. She records their suffering like a botanist recording plant growth. Another notes, "What's most chilling is her complete lack of emotional engagement. There's no hatred in these pages, no anger, no ideology, just cold curiosity about how much pain produces what behavioral changes." The notebooks become case studies in what psychologists call pathological detachment, the ability to cause extreme suffering while maintaining complete emotional distance from the humanity of victims. The moral reckoning. Was executing Elisabeth Becker justice, or was the botched execution, whether accidental or intentional, a descent to her level? The legal answer is clear. She was tried, convicted, and sentenced according to established military tribunal procedures. The evidence was overwhelming. She admitted to her actions. The sentence was carried out. Justice, by legal definition, was served. But morally, that's infinitely more complex. Elisabeth Becker tortured thousands of women and children. She innovated methods specifically designed to maximize psychological and physical suffering. She took notes on their pain like a researcher studying lab animals. She showed no remorse, no recognition of their humanity, no acknowledgement that she'd done anything wrong. When she died badly, when that guillotine blade stuck in her neck for 4 seconds of awareness, was that poetic justice, or did it undermine the moral authority of the tribunal by making her execution as brutal as her crimes? The survivors who witnessed her execution have different answers. One Polish woman who testified at Becker's trial later wrote, "When that blade stuck, when I saw that it didn't cut cleanly, part of me felt satisfaction. She spent years perfecting pain. She deserved to feel it herself, even for just a few seconds. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe that makes me no better than her. I don't know, but I felt it." Another survivor had the opposite reaction. "When the execution went wrong, I felt sick, not because I pitied her. I didn't, but because it reminded me that violence begets violence. We executed her to prove we were better than the Nazis, that we valued human dignity and the rule of law. But a botched execution that causes suffering, that's not justice, that's revenge. And revenge makes us more like them." Both women are right. Both women are wrong. The truth exists somewhere in the uncomfortable space between justice and vengeance. The question of evil. What makes Elisabeth Becker so disturbing, what keeps her case studied in psychology and criminology courses decades later, is her complete lack of emotional motivation. Most perpetrators of atrocity have some kind of emotional driver. Hitler had hatred. Stalin had paranoia. Even other concentration camp guards had fear of punishment or ideological fervor. Becker had nothing, no ideology, no hatred, no fear, just cold clinical curiosity about how much suffering she could inflict and what results it would produce. She wasn't a true believer, she was a researcher.
And that makes her almost more frightening than ideologically driven killers, because it means you don't need to hate someone to torture them. You don't need to believe in a cause to destroy lives. You just need to be curious about suffering and have the power to experiment. Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil, how ordinary people commit extraordinary atrocities through bureaucratic detachment. Elisabeth Becker represents something slightly different, the curiosity of evil. She didn't just follow orders, she innovated, she refined, she documented. She turned cruelty into a discipline. The lesson we refuse to learn. Here's the uncomfortable truth about Elisabeth Becker. She proves that some of the worst atrocities aren't committed by monsters. They're committed by people who are just curious about what happens when you remove all moral constraints from human behavior. Becker was a nurse before she became a concentration camp guard. She chose a caring profession. But when given the opportunity to hurt people with impunity, she discovered she was very, very good at it. And being good at something, even something horrific, can become its own motivation. This is the lesson psychology students study her for, how easily professional competence can replace moral consideration, how being effective can become more important than asking, "Should I be doing this at all?" She was good at torture. She took pride in being good at it. And that pride, that professional satisfaction in a job well done, insulated her from ever questioning whether the job should have been done in the first place. The arc bends slowly, imperfectly. On May 13, 1947, at 2:02 a.m., justice came for Elisabeth Becker. It came imperfectly, a blade that stuck, 4 seconds of suffering instead of instant death. It came late. Thousands had already died under her cruelty. It came incomplete. Her death didn't heal her victim's trauma, but it came. The woman who spent years perfecting torture, who took meticulous notes on suffering, who treated human beings as experimental subjects, she died experiencing a fraction of the violence she inflicted. 4 seconds of a blade stuck in her neck, not much compared to the years of suffering she caused. But 4 seconds is a long time when you're being decapitated, long enough to know you're dying, long enough to feel it happening, long enough to understand that everything you did has led to this moment. Did she feel remorse in those 4 seconds? Did she finally understand the suffering she caused? Probably not. People like Elisabeth Becker rarely achieve that kind of clarity. She likely died the same way she lived, detached, clinical, emotionally disconnected from the reality of her own mortality. But we can hope. We can hope that in those final seconds, as the blade stuck in her neck and consciousness flickered, some small part of her finally understood she wasn't a researcher. She was just a torturer who took detailed notes. The notebooks survive in archives. The victim's testimony survive in trial transcripts. The beast of Ravensbrück survives in historical memory as a warning. Not all evil announces itself with dramatic ideology. Sometimes it walks into a room with a notebook and a curiosity about how much pain one person can inflict on another. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice catches up with that evil, even if it takes 4 seconds longer than it should.